Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video of History by Podcast. Today I am interviewing Professor Jodi Magness once again in person, but this time in Houston, Texas, rather than in San Antonio, Texas, which is where I first interviewed her a couple months ago during the SPL conference in 2023. So it's good to have you interview in person once again, Professor Magness.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Can you tell us a bit about the conference that's being convened right now?
Yeah, the conference this weekend is a conference on biblical archaeology in honor of the 90th birthday of William G. Deaver, Bill Deaver, who is one of the most eminent biblical archaeologists. And so we're basically celebrating his birthday.
Wow. And what are you going to be presenting at the conference?
Yeah, so my paper is titled, "What is Biblical Archaeology and Should It Have a Future?" And the question is posed because although many people, when I talk to them, think of me as a biblical archaeologist, in professional terms here in North America, the period that I cover is not considered to be biblical archaeology. Biblical archaeology, defined in academic terms in this country, is the Bronze Age, Iron Age, meaning the period of the Old Testament. And I, of course, specialize in the period of the New Testament. So my paper explores why that definition came about, how it came about, and then sort of considers what should the future of biblical archaeology be.
And what do you think that future might look like?
Yeah, boy, I like to say as an archaeologist, I study the past and not the future. So it's hard for me to predict. I do think that in general archaeology, and then within that, of course, biblical archaeology, the future of the discipline is really tied to the future of other studies of humanities, arts, and social sciences within the American academic context. And of course, those disciplines have been eroding in recent years, a process that has accelerated. So I do think that what's going to happen in the future will be part of bigger trends, greater trends in particularly in the study of the humanities in American academia.
What do you think is causing it to erode?
Well, the erosion's been going on for a very long time. I think it's a complex problem. It's like all problems. There's not one answer, one solution.
Right.
So I think that there is a kind of a perception that these are disciplines that if you major in them, they're not going to get you a job. This has been sort of accelerated by the promotion of STEM disciplines over the humanities, with, of course, the idea that those will get you a job when you graduate. And then, there are other factors like the high cost of higher education. So is it worth it for parents to invest so much money, or for students for that matter, to invest so much money in their future when they don't see that they're going to get a paying job? I think it's all kind of interconnected with that. And I think there are other factors as well, but it's certainly a trend that's been going on for, I think, at least the last couple of decades, if not more. But I also see it accelerating. I teach in that kind of framework, so I do see it accelerating now.
And what do you think is causing it to accelerate?
I think what's causing it to accelerate is precisely the emphasis on STEM. And I want to make clear, I don't have anything against STEM, not at all. But I do think that a good liberal arts education needs to include the liberal arts. And so the way I see students now coming in as undergraduates, and they're already right from the start deciding that they're going, or having come in deciding that they're going to major in STEM, means automatically that they've eliminated exploring the various options within other fields. So I think that's really a big part of it.
I would like to now shift to discussing your work on Masada. Does the archaeology that's been done at Masada verify Josephus' description of the battle?
Right. So just to give a little bit of background for your listeners who might not be that familiar with Masada. So Masada is a mountain overlooking the southwest shore of the Dead Sea that was fortified by King Herod the Great in the 1st century BC. And just to clarify, I'm going to use BC and AD instead of BCE and CE here, just because they sound more familiar. So anyway, about 70 years after the death of Herod, in the year 66 AD, a Jewish revolt broke out against the Romans, which is called the First Jewish Revolt against the Romans. And at that point, the mountain was taken over, the fortified mountain was taken over by bands of Jewish rebels who held out there for the duration of the revolt. The revolt officially ended 4 years after it began in the year 70 AD, when the Romans took Jerusalem and destroyed the Second Temple on the Temple Mount. But Masada continued to hold out against the Romans for about 3 years after the fall of Jerusalem. And so we have a detailed description of these events, including the Roman siege of Masada, provided by the first century AD Jewish historian Josephus, or Flavius Josephus.
Mhm.
And he tells us about how the Romans come, they encircle the base of the mountain, they build siege works, they take a battering ram, they build a siege ramp, an assault ramp, they take a battering ram up to the top, and eventually the mountain falls to them. So all of this is described by Josephus. And what is very interesting is that we still have archaeological remains of the siege works that Josephus describes in his account. And the short answer to your question is yes. The archaeology overall is consistent with what Josephus describes.
Does it confirm pretty much everything that he says, with the possible exception of the mass suicide?
Almost entirely. So we'll just leave the very fall of the mountain aside for now, because you mentioned the mass suicide, because according to Josephus, at the very end of the siege, when the Romans were about to break through and take the mountain, the Jewish families, there were families holding out at that point, decided to basically commit mass suicide or mass homicide, whatever, before giving themselves up alive to the Romans. So we'll leave that aside. But the rest of what Josephus describes, the Romans coming, building a circumvallation wall, building their camps, building an assault ramp, to get to the top of the mountain, all of that is very consistent with the archaeology. There's actually only really one thing that I can think of in Josephus's description that is not consistent with the archaeology. And that is that Josephus describes the Romans firing these giant, catapult darts, these giant, they're like big torsion bow arrows up to the mountain. And in the excavations on top of the mountain, no bolts like that were found. So when Yiga El-Yadin excavated the top of the mountain, he didn't find anything like that. And that was one big inconsistency in Josephus's account, which originally led me and a co-author to surmise that Josephus's description of the attack was formulaic, at least in some parts. But later, after consulting with another colleague, I actually reconsidered that. And now what I think is more likely is that whatever types of bolts these were that were fired, they would have been collected after the end of the siege by the Romans and reused or melted down. And the reason I say that is because if you look at the distribution of arrowheads, the smaller arrowheads, around the top of the mountain, you can see that many of them were fired in kind of an arc around the top when the Romans get to the top. But you can also see that many of them were collected after the end of the siege, because the Romans left a garrison on top of the mountain for a couple of decades after the siege, and they would have collected any reusable weapons. They would have melted down any that weren't reusable and used them to make something else. So actually, I'm not sure that part of the description is in fact inconsistent with Josephus's account.
And how long did the fighting last? Does the archaeology support what Josephus says about how long the battle at Masada lasted?
Yeah, Josephus doesn't, to my recollection, doesn't mention how long the fighting lasted. There is kind of a popular impression, I think, that this whole process of the Roman siege and fall of Masada took 3 years. And the reason I think that's in kind of the popular imagination is that it's about 3 years from the fall of Jerusalem to the fall of Masada. So people think, oh, that's how long, this whole thing took. But that's absolutely not the case, because after the fall of Masada, the Romans then, and not immediately, but soon afterwards, sent troops out to take the remaining holdout fortresses. And Masada was actually the last of 3. They first marched against Herodium, which is near Bethlehem. And then there was a siege at Machaerus, which is on the east side of the Dead Sea in Jordan today. And then finally, either in the year 72 or 73, they arrived at the foot of Masada. So first of all, we know that it wasn't a 3-year process, the siege of Masada. How long the siege actually lasted depends on who you follow. It was somewhere between a minimum of a couple of months up to a maximum of maybe 6 months. It probably was closer to the 2 months, maybe as short even as 7 weeks. A number of years ago, an American scholar named Jonathan Roth did a very detailed study on the logistics of the siege of Masada. And he was able to show through his study that the siege from beginning to end could have lasted only 7 weeks. That includes the Romans arriving at the base of the mountain, building a circumvallation wall around the base, building the assault ramp, taking the battering ram up and battering through the wall, that the whole thing could have taken as little as 7 weeks, because we have to remember that the Roman army was a professional army, and this is what the soldiers were trained to do. So I tend to think actually towards the sort of lower end of the scale, that the siege maybe took only a couple of months from beginning to end. And no matter how long or short you think it was within the span that I mentioned, it did take place over the course of a winter-spring season, meaning the Romans weren't stupid. They didn't have the siege out in the summer months when it was really hot. They besieged the mountain when it was cooler during the winter-spring.
What did Yigael Yadin believe to be evidence for the mass suicide? What did he find that he interpreted as evidence for the mass suicide?
Yeah, it's interesting. The top of Masada was excavated in the 1960s by Yigael Yadin, who was a very famous Israeli archaeologist. He also was a famous politician, and he had served as chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces. So he was a very well-known public figure. And it's important to remember, before I disagree with Yadin on this point, that in the period that Yadin lived and worked, scholars tended to read sources like Josephus more literally than they do today. So when Yadin looked at Josephus's account of the siege of Masada, for example, he read it rather literally. He understood Josephus as reporting what actually had happened and thought it was accurate. Whereas there's been a trend in scholarship since that time to be more critical of sources like Josephus. And in fact, the trend has really gone exactly in the opposite way. So today you have scholars who don't think anything in Josephus can be relied upon, right? I don't advocate that view, but just to say that the way that Yadin approached Josephus is partly because he was a product of the time that he lived in. So having said that, what did Yadin? So when Yadin read Josephus, he understood Josephus's account of the mass suicide as being literally true. He thought and so what does Josephus describe? So what Josephus says is that the Romans built the assault ramp. They get the battering ram up to the top. They start to batter through the wall, and it's clear that the mountain is about to fall. And at that point, the leader of the Jewish rebels, whose name was Elazar ben Yair, convened all of the Jews together in possibly in the synagogue. There's a room that Yadin identified on top of the mountain as a synagogue, meaning an assembly hall. And he gathered them together. And actually what he did was he gathered the men together and gave them a speech, and actually gave them a couple of speeches, and convinced them that the best way to rob the Romans of their hard-won victory would be if they first committed suicide. And he convinced them to do this. So what they did was each man then got his family, his wife and children, and killed them. And then all of the men got together and they drew lots. And out of those men, 10 men killed the others. And then those remaining 10 men got together and drew lots again. And out of them, 1 man killed the other 9, and then finally committed suicide himself. And just a couple of points about this. So first of all, there's been a lot of controversy about this, because according to biblical Jewish law, suicide is prohibited. So calling it a mass suicide, this kind of goes against Jewish law. But so there's that. But my eminent colleague at New York University, Larry Schiffman, has pointed out to me, in fact, it wasn't a mass suicide, it was a mass homicide, because there's only 1 man who dies at his own hand. But of course, homicide is also forbidden according to Jewish law. So either way, it doesn't matter. Either way, it's going against Jewish law. But so when Yadin read that account, he believed that it was literally true. And he interpreted the archaeological remains that he excavated in light of that. And here I should actually point out that, people think of archaeology as a science, which it is, but it's not an exact science. And just like anything, including other sciences, by the way, archaeology is open to interpretation. So you could take the same archaeological remains and interpret them differently. And in this case, Yadin's interpretation was influenced by his understanding of Josephus's account. And so, for example, Yadin found a group of inscribed potsherds, what are called ostraca, in a room in sort of the northern palace complex, near the northern palace, which was Herod's residential palace on top of Masada. So in a room there, he found a group of these inscribed potsherds, and they had Hebrew names on them. And one of them, in fact, has the name Ben Yair. Very interesting. And so Yadin interpreted these ostraca as the lots, right? Now, the problem is that there are 12 ostraca in the group, not 10. So what did Yadin do? One of them was clearly never been completed. So he said, okay, we can disregard the one that's never completed. But then you're left with 11. So what did he say? He said, well, Elazar ben Yair, he was the head of the rebels. We can disregard him as well. And that's how we got to 10. Well, after Yadin died, which was in 1984, the material from his excavations was inherited by his colleagues at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and has been published over the years in a series of volumes. So eventually, the ostraca were studied and published by another expert who was unable to conclude that they were, in fact, the lots. And one of the reasons is that we have inscribed potsherds that were found in rebel contexts all over the top of Masada, and it's clear that they were used for various purposes. For example, meal ration tickets. So it's impossible to prove that that group of ostraca that Yadin found was in fact, or were in fact, the lots that Josephus describes. Now, there's another example of this. And so one of the things that you might have expected from Josephus's account, so according to Josephus, there were 967 Jewish rebels on top of Masada at the time the Romans took the mountain. So 967 men, women, and children, because these were families. So you might have expected that Yadin would find 967 human remains somewhere on top of the mountain, but he did not. He found a group of 3 skeletons, a man, woman, and child, apparently rebels or Jews, because they were associated with Jewish artifacts. On the lowest terrace of the Northern Palace complex, they were buried and collapsed there. He found another group of skeletons, and here it's not clear how many, somewhere between 5 to 25, in a cistern on the southeast side of the mountain. And the identity, not only the number, but the identity of those skeletons is very difficult. They could be Jewish rebels or Jewish families, but they could also be Roman soldiers. They could be Byzantine monks, because there was a monastery on top of the mountain in the Byzantine period. So anyway, those are all the skeletons that Yadin found. So what did Yadin assume? Okay, he assumed Josephus's account is accurate. The Romans come up, there's a battle or whatever. Then the Jews kill themselves, whatever. Everybody's dead. And Yadin assumed then that when the Romans came up and found all of these dead bodies lying around, that the Romans then cleared them away, because the Romans left a garrison on top of the mountain after it fell, and they wouldn't have left rotting corpses lying around. So Yadin surmised, well, they must have then taken all of these corpses that were lying around and either burned them, because the Romans used cremation, or maybe buried them in a mass grave somewhere. The 3 apparently Jewish skeletons on the in the lowest terrace of the Northern Palace complex were buried in the collapse of that palace, which had sort of crushed them, collapsed on top of them when it burned. So they were sort of buried in that collapse. But what happened to the rest? Okay, so they were cleared out and collected. Well, let's assume for a minute that there was no mass suicide at Masada, because we can't prove that there was. Let's say there was no mass suicide or mass homicide. Let's say the Romans break through the wall and there's a pitched battle, and some of the Jews are killed and the rest are led away into slavery. Well, the same thing would have happened. The Romans would have cleared away whatever corpses were lying around and disposed of them. So in this case, again, archaeology does not provide a clear indication of whether Josephus's account is literally true.
But does it seem to confirm that it was a major battle? Does it seem to correspond to Josephus's description of the battle itself?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In other words, the actual assault and battle. In other words, and by battle here, let me clarify. This is prior to the fall of the mountain. In other words, this is outside the walls of the top of the fort, right? The mountain is surrounded by a fortification wall. So all of this is leading up to when the Romans actually batter through the wall and break into the mountain. So everything that Josephus describes, not everything, but pretty much what Josephus describes up to that point is consistent with what we see in the archaeology. The big controversy is about what is the situation inside the wall on top of the mountain at the time the Romans break through the wall. Were there still Jews alive, and was there then a big battle on top of the mountain, or were they all dead, having committed mass suicide, as Yadin understood Josephus? I will also say that like everything else about Masada, even what happens with the Roman assault on the mountain has been the subject of controversy. So I have colleagues, including Israeli archaeological colleagues, who believe that even the description of the assault of the mountain is inaccurate. They have proposed that the assault ramp, for example, was never completed, and that therefore that part of Josephus's account is also inaccurate. I won't go into the archaeological, minutiae, but I disagree with that point of view, and I do think that as I said, the archaeology supports Josephus's description that there was a Roman siege, that there was a Roman assault on the mountain. The big question is what happens in that very last moment when the Romans break through the wall and enter the top of the mountain. What was the situation at that point?
So pretty much the major detail that's being questioned here, setting aside maybe a few minor details, is the mass suicide in itself.
That's absolutely right. So what has been the subject of a lot of controversy is the mass suicide itself. And in fact, that's the reason why Masada is so famous. Because if it wasn't for Josephus's description of the mass suicide, Masada would be like just about any other archaeological site. But it's the story of the mass suicide that makes it so special in a way that makes it the icon that it has become.
So could it be that if the mass suicide turned out to be, let's say somehow it got proven later in the future, that Josephus indeed made that up? Do you think a possible reason could be that it's part of his embellishment, maybe a little bit of Roman propaganda, since he was working for the Flavians?
Yeah, so this goes back to scholars who question the historicity of the mass suicide, whether it actually occurred or not. So how has this come about? That is, if in Yadin's time, people like Yadin, and this was pretty much the way scholars thought, if they thought that Josephus can be taken at face value and the story of the mass suicide is true, so how have we gotten from that to questioning the mass suicide and indeed Josephus's very reliability today? So what happened is that in more recent years, some scholars have pointed to problems with Josephus's account of the mass suicide. And what they have noticed specifically is that if you go through Josephus's writings, and he wrote a lot, so we have volumes and volumes of his writings. So if you go through his writings, you will see that there are various stories that he tells which end with a mass suicide, where there's an attack on a city or people or whatever, and at the end, everybody commits mass suicide. So this happens repeatedly in Josephus's works. So what these scholars have questioned is it possible that so many people were committing mass suicide? Or could it be that Josephus invented this as an ending to the story to make it more exciting, right? So in other words, is the mass suicide a literary device that was used by Josephus to make the work more exciting? Now, I know what some people might be thinking is, but wait a minute, the Romans were at Masada. Wouldn't they have objected when Josephus, who was writing for the Roman imperial family, right? Wouldn't they have objected to Josephus inventing an end to a story that wasn't true, that was fabricated, right? But there, what you would be expecting is objective history in the modern sense of the word, if even such a thing as objectivity exists. But today, when we read a history, we do expect that we're going to be reading about what actually happened and not what, the writer fabricated, right? Well, the problem is that the Romans had no such expectation. The idea of objectivity did not exist in antiquity. Writers like Josephus wrote to entertain their readers. So the Romans would be reading this as kind of like a fun, historical novel, if you wish, and also to convey a moral, like there's a moral or a message to the story. So the Romans would not necessarily have objected to Josephus fabricating this story of the mass suicide as an ending to the fall of Masada. Now, some people might wonder, but wait a minute, wouldn't the Romans have objected to Josephus fabricating an end to the story that elevates the Jews and makes them look heroic? Because when you read Josephus's account and you read Eleazar ben Yair's speeches, which pretty much certainly are fabricated by Josephus, but at any rate, when you read all of that, it makes the Jews look heroic and noble in preferring to die at their own hand than be taken into captivity or killed at the hands of the Romans. And so people might wonder, well, wait a minute, wouldn't the Romans, who again were basically overseeing what Josephus wrote, he was commissioned by his imperial patrons to write these books, wouldn't they have objected to Josephus elevating the Jews in the eyes of his readers? But remember, there is no glory in defeating a weak enemy. Your victory is elevated if your enemy is strong. So by elevating the Jews in the eyes of readers, Josephus also would have been elevating the victory of the Romans over the Jews. And in fact, the title of this work that contains the story of Masada, is The Jewish War. So, it's all about the Roman victory over the Jews. So that wouldn't have been a problem either. And so then what we're left with when we consider all of these different factors, we're left with the archaeology. And the question then is, and this is what people always ask, well, doesn't the archaeology tell us then whether the mass suicide actually took place or not? And the problem is, as we just saw, is that no, archaeology does not solve this problem, because the same archaeological remains can be interpreted either as supporting Josephus's account or as contradicting it, depending on who you believe. And I'll mention just one more little piece of the archaeology. So getting a little bit into the nitty gritty, but maybe some of your listeners have been to the top of Masada. So Herod, when he built Masada in the 1st century BC, built 2 big palace complexes, one at the northern end of the mountain, which we call the Northern Palace Complex, and one on the western side, the Western Palace Complex. The Northern Palace Complex has rooms, the actual palace rooms, are situated on 3 terraces that spill over the northern edge of the cliff. And those palatial rooms, which are the private part of the palace, were separated from the other parts of that palace, meaning the service rooms, slaves' quarters, things like that, workshops. So that the actual palace rooms were separated from the rest of that complex by a very large white wall, which basically runs across the top of the mountain. Very large, big sloping plastered white wall. Well, when Yadin excavated that wall in the 1960s, he found piled against it a huge mound of chalky white dirt mixed with a lot of artifacts, pieces of pottery, glass, all sorts of other stuff. And what was surmised, and what many archaeologists have surmised since then, is that what you have here is basically a large dump that where when the Romans come up to the top of the mountain, they start going through things and plundering. And this was basically a large dump that was piled up against the wall. But more recently, an Israeli archaeologist, Hillel Geva, has proposed that this white mound of chalk mixed with stuff that's piled up against that big wall, that this is actually a mini assault ramp. That when the Romans got to the top of Masada, there's fighting that takes place, and some of the Jewish rebels take refuge in the innermost rooms of Herod's northern palace, which was fortified by this big wall. And so what Hillel Geva suggests is that the Romans then made like a little mini assault ramp piled up against that big white wall in order to break through into the Northern Palace complex. Now, I'm a little bit agnostic. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea. I'm not convinced that it's right. But the point is that if that is correct, it would certainly mean that there was no mass suicide. Why? Because it would mean that there was still fighting going on top of the mountain. So you can see how you can take the various archaeological remains that we have and interpret them in different ways.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Dead Sea Scroll fragments that were found at Masada? How many of them were there?
Right. So let me clarify about the use of the term Dead Sea Scroll fragments. Right. So we have on top of Masada different fragments of documents from different contexts on top of the mountain. Technically, you could refer to them as Dead Sea Scrolls, but they're okay. So now I need to clarify the term Dead Sea Scrolls. So most people in the public, and not just the public, even some scholars, when you say Dead Sea Scrolls, automatically they think of the site of Qumran, which is on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, so some distance to the north of Masada on the western shore of the Dead Sea. Qumran is the site where the quote-unquote Dead Sea Scrolls were found, which are scrolls that were deposited in the caves around that site by members of a Jewish sect that lived there in the 1st century BC, 1st century AD, a sect that many scholars, including myself, identify with the Essenes. And those scrolls include copies of books of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, as well as works that are related to biblical literature and works that describe the particular beliefs and practices of that sect, so what we call sectarian works. The term Dead Sea Scrolls is generally used to describe that corpus of literature. Many scholars, however, especially ones who specialize in Qumran, prefer not to use the term Dead Sea Scrolls, but rather Qumran scrolls or something like that. And why? Because you could also use the term Dead Sea Scroll to refer to any document found in the area of the Dead Sea, including documents that have nothing to do with the site of Qumran. And that actually sometimes happens. So within the last, 5 years or so, the Israel Antiquities Authority released this big media splash release that new quote-unquote Dead Sea Scrolls had been found. Well, guess what? Those were scrolls not connected at all with the site of Qumran. They were found much farther south and have nothing to do with that community, and in fact don't even date to the same period. They're a little bit later in date. And so when you use the term Dead Sea Scroll, I know that in your mind, you're thinking of the site of Qumran, but so here's the problem. So your question, if we try to reframe it, I'll try to reframe it here, is, did Yadin find in his excavations ancient scrolls on top of Masada that are related to the scrolls that were found at Qumran farther to the north? And by the way, even if they are the same types of works, that doesn't mean that they came from Qumran. It could mean that these were scrolls that were just more generally in circulation among the Jewish population at that time, and that some of them ended up at Masada, if that makes sense, right? So all of this to say, yes, Yadin did find actually fragments of some ancient scrolls at Masada, including some biblical scrolls, by the way. These come from different contexts on top of the mountain. But there are at least a couple of instances of ancient scrolls that are found among the Dead Sea Scrolls that are not biblical scrolls. For example, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. This is the best known of this group that we're discussing, which are not biblical scrolls and which are compatible with the beliefs of the group that lived at Qumran, the Jewish sect that lived at Qumran. And so as a result, scholars are divided. And they're divided just along the lines that I described before. So some scholars, including Yadin, suggested that maybe after Qumran was destroyed in 68 AD by the Romans, or even in advance of that, some members of that sect at Qumran fled south to Masada, joined the Jews who were on top of the mountain there, holding out on top of the mountain, and brought with them these works. And so maybe these scrolls actually were originally at Qumran and were brought by members of this sect somewhere just after 68 AD, possibly. But other scholars object and say, but these scrolls, even though they are compatible with the outlook and the beliefs of the sect that lived at Qumran, are not necessarily sectarian works. They're not necessarily works of the Essenes, meaning that they could have been circulating among other groups in the Jewish population at the same time. And so whether or not there were members of the Qumran sect present on top of Masada is a matter about which scholars do not agree. Now, I have to actually say that I agree with Yadin on this point. And the reason that I agree is not just because of the scrolls, but because I think we have archaeological evidence that supports it. And that is that the scrolls at Qumran that were found in caves were associated with a very distinctive type of pottery jar, a jar that's tall and cylindrical in shape and was covered with a bowl-shaped lid. And these jars are found in large numbers in the caves with the scrolls around Qumran and also in the site of Qumran, but for all intents and purposes are not found anywhere else. They were apparently manufactured at Qumran and used by members of the sect, probably to store scrolls, but not only. Well, we have a small number of fragments of jars like this at Masada in rebel contexts. And because, again, they're so rare, they're so distinctive, that together with the scrolls, these few fragments of scrolls suggest to me that Yadin was right, that, maybe a small number of members of the Qumran sect made their way south and joined the group on top of Masada and were there when, let's say, the mountain fell in 73.
And then my closing question, since we only have 4 minutes left, is you mentioned in your book on Masada that Josephus mentions that there was a couple of people at Child that tried to flee the suicide and they hid somehow. And I think you suggested that that's a possibility about how Josephus may have heard about certain things, maybe including the speeches and suicide and stuff like that. Can you tell us about what you think about that?
Right. Well, this is what Josephus tells us, right? So then this, and actually some of your listeners might already have picked up on this, which is, but wait a minute, if Josephus's account of the mass suicide is true and everybody committed suicide, then how do we know the story of how they committed suicide, right? With the lots and everything, because when the Romans came up, they would have found everybody dead. So how does that work? So Josephus actually tells us that, yes, there was this mass suicide, but a couple of old women overheard the plans to commit suicide, and they hid out in a cistern on the side of the mountain together with some children. And when the Romans came up to the top and took over the mountain, they gave themselves up alive to the Romans. And then somehow, either directly or indirectly, the story of the mass suicide was told to Josephus. So that's kind of how you solve that problem. And I'll also mention, by the way, that we're not sure if Josephus even ever visited Masada. Josephus was a native of Jerusalem. He was born in Jerusalem. He was living in the country at the time of the first revolt, but we don't know if he ever himself was at Masada or if he only heard about it from others or was relying on written sources describing it. So, the account, the mass suicide, obviously the fall of the mountain, he wasn't there at the time. So whatever reports he got, he would have been getting from other sources. But the Romans, by the way, kept pretty good records of their military campaigns. So he would have had pretty good information to draw on.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Magness.
Thank you for having me.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.